Hello, and welcome to episode 187 of the Book Binge, where this week we're covering a pretty new thing for me, my second, I believe, debut of this year, a 2024 release. Not very often that I review brand new releases on this channel or read them the year that they come out. This one came out in the middle of July, so just a few months back. The West Passage by Jared, I believe it's pronounced Pechaček, something along those lines. I saw a Reddit Q&A that the author did and asked me anything, and someone asked about the pronunciation of his name, and it seemed that was approximately the way that he had it like spelt out for pronunciation, if I'm remembering correctly, of course, so forgive me if I absolutely butchered the name. The West Passage is definitely an interesting and intriguing book conceptually. If you read the kind of blurb of what it's about on Amazon or something like that, it has some pretty cool ideas going on in there. As a result of those ideas and this amazing cover, let's just talk about that for a minute. I know I showed it off just a second ago. Look at that cover. It is so cool. It's a lot of the reason why I was interested in giving this a shot. But those of us in the Sun Eater fan Discord that I help to run, the Red Company, we did this for a read-along book just a couple of months ago, right after we finished reading The Failures by Benjamin Lyer, another debut from this year, which actually released just a couple of weeks before this one did, and one of my favorite books of the year. We read this after that for the read-along. I'm not sure if I would have picked this up if not for the read-along, but it was certainly an interesting pick and a unique read. That is one of the main things going for it, is just kind of how off the wall it is, how interesting a lot of its ideas are. But was it a hit? Well, we shall talk about that. Let's start off, as I always do in these reviews, with the good of the West Passage. I gotta say, I really loved the general vibe and tone of the book as a whole. Yeah, that was definitely something I really connected with. There's a very sort of fairy tale and fable-esque type of storytelling design and structure to the West Passage that is pretty addictive in that way that kids' stories are, which is also aided by the fact that there's like 50-something chapters, despite this being less than 400 pages. It's like 380 pages with over 50 chapters. So a lot of the chapters are just a few pages long. It really helps the pace move along in a good way. But going along with that fairy tale and fable-esque type of tone that I talked about, there's also a lot of interesting folkloric vibes going on in here. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff borrowed from a lot of different folklores around the world that are utilized or twisted, or borrowed from, homage paid to maybe in the West Passage, that I'm sure I just have absolutely no idea the references because I haven't read or don't know the folklore of what some of the things are based off of. But if you're someone who's very well versed in a lot of fairy tales, fables, folklore, that kind of stuff, there's maybe a good chance that you'll enjoy this because there's a lot of those vibes. There's a lot of stuff like that going on tonally. And like I said, probably a lot of references to stuff to one degree or another that maybe I don't know about. Of course, I could be wrong on that because I don't know the folklore, but that is definitely the vibe that I got and is one of the best things of the book. Another thing that I really liked is that there are very cool world building ideas and concepts going on here. And one of the fellow readers of the book, and actually the owner of said Red Company Sun Eater fan Discord, Orion, has said that there's a lot of Bloodborne as an influence for this, or at least felt a lot of Bloodborne vibes in here. And reading some of the answers that Jared gave on that Reddit AMA that I saw and looked up, Bloodborne was indeed an influence in some regard for the world building of the palace in the West Passage, and even though I didn't necessarily see that or feel that inherently when I was reading it, I can see why some people would make that connection, and I can see why Jared would obviously say it was an influence. In fact, in regards to the palace and most especially the ladies of the towers of the palace. In fact, all of the various ladies are kind of depicted in the cover here. Lady of Grey Tower, Red, Blue House, Yellow House, all of those. A lot of the ladies were specifically described by Jared as basically just being Bloodborne bosses in dresses. So there's a lot of like interesting kind of ideas going on there with twists to what you would normally expect to see in something like this. Very cool concepts overall, mingling with the world and with the ladies and with some of the lore and history and stuff going on here. There's not a whole lot of it that is explored in depth, but the little tidbits that you get are very cool, absolutely very cool. The artwork of the West Passage is also something that I really like and think is great. I've already showed off this cover a bunch of times, but there's also some pretty great artwork hidden throughout as well. The chapter headings have artwork that is done specifically by the author. Let me make sure that that is actually showing up on the screen well enough. The various books also have, or the parts of the book have artwork by the author, and these are all very cool stuff. I really like the artwork and the vibe that kind of helps setting up the tone and gives a little bit of that fairy tale vibe that I've kind of described up to this point. You know, the artwork is pretty good over the course of this. The other good thing about this book, however, we will talk about in the ugly section of this video. You'll soon see why we're going to cover it there. But let's move on for now into the bad of the West Passage. Some of the things that I wasn't necessarily so keen on as a whole. One of these things was the prose, which, while being good for the tone, the fairy tale kind of thing, can sometimes feel a little bit off. It feels a bit distant, sometimes a little bit more distant than I feel like it should. And the sort of like bedtime story narrator type of thing going on, or narration rather, with the story sometimes kind of like comes and goes. So it switches sometimes a little bit like suddenly between a more omniscient narration and a more limited narration, and sometimes it feels a little bit weird when it's going back and forth with the intermingling of this. There's certain aspects of the prose that are just really weird. There's a couple moments of where like cursing, swear words are utilized in the narration of the book that just feel super duper out of place. I am not a person who is necessarily inherently opposed to bad language. One of my favorite books of the year is The Failures, and like there's a lot of cursing in that, but where the cursing really worked for The Failures, it does not in here. It's only utilized a handful of times, you know, like F words or something every once in a while. And it felt like it was only utilized in the sense of like, oh yeah, this is a book that swears, but I don't feel like it actually needed it. It never needed it. Swearing was always jarring and kind of upset, and kind of made the tone and the immersion of the story just completely shatter like immediately in a single word. So there's some of that stuff there. The world building, which was something that I commented on as being good and cool, isn't always clear, however. So that's something that I wasn't always following along with the great, or with that great. The internal logic of the West Passage as far as the palace and how it's constructed just doesn't really work in my mind. It didn't really click for me. I had a very hard time visualizing anything world building wise in this book, even though there are plenty of cool ideas. There are little bits of it that work that I really liked and got immersed in, but there's a lot of other stuff that's just like, wait a minute, how does this even make sense type of moments. Unfortunately, also the characters are largely pretty meh. I don't think they're largely bad, but there's just not really enough time spent with them to give them enough of an identity to feel I could connect to them overall. In general, I feel like the major problem with the West Passage is that it's too short, actually. It's kind of nice to have a book, especially a standalone book that is less than 400 pages in today's day and age, but this definitely felt like something that either should have been like twice as long, or maybe even more than that, or just had like 3 installments, been like a trilogy of like 200-page books or something like that, because then you can cover the story arc, but also expand on some of the world building, expand on some of the characters, and expand on some of the plot, because a lot of the stuff just doesn't feel like it has as much room to breathe as it needs, and as such, I think this is a lot of why the narration can feel pretty distant. While I can appreciate the fact that this is short and a standalone, I don't think it was necessarily the right way to go for this story in particular. Now, for the last points, and this is going to wrap up kind of the good and the bad together, because part of what I'm going to talk about here now in the ugly is a good thing, but there's also some bad that's mixed along with it and kind of goes on what I was just saying. Basically, continuing on the too short point, these characters, the creatures of this world, and a lot of the world building definitely needed more time. But a lot of this is not just because of the world building or the characters not feeling fully fleshed out. Part of it is also like visually speaking. Now, Imagery is something that can be pretty hit or miss in a book, especially with a debut author like Jared, but I can say that this book has a ton of really cool visual stuff going on. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of showing, it's a lot of telling, and this didn't really do it for me either. Visually, like I said, this book has some of the coolest concepts I've ever experienced in a book that I'm super interested and intrigued by, but I feel like they're actually heavily underserved by being a novel. This story, a lot of these ideas are something that really should have been a movie or an animated miniseries or something along those lines. You get a couple explicit mentions of things every now and again, especially as far as like what some of the creatures are fundamentally biologically, we'll say, but mostly it's nothing. So you end up with a feeling of disconnection from what everything actually looks like in this world. If not for the artwork that I praised, like in chapter headings and stuff, it'd be nigh on impossible to tell that this has some of the fairy tale fable type of stuff going on with creatures and whatnot. There's no real beautiful imagery within the prose to make anything pop. Just as the world construction isn't super clear, neither are the character constructions. The ladies are basically just bloodborne bosses in dresses, but like you barely get that vibe aside from the sickly aura and their gigantic gargantuan size that is mentioned everywhere. Besides those two specific things, you don't really understand what these ladies actually look like or how they appear. And this is a problem with basically all the characters and the entirety of the world. There's ultimately a ton of cool stuff here. There's a ton of cool stuff here, I will reiterate, but I think this should have been a movie or a miniseries, probably an animated one, like I said, because most of this just kind of flies over the head. There's not enough time in this book, as short as it is, to really make any of that pop out and be really that engaging, at least for me. So for the recommendation, this is a little bit of a complicated one. I think there is definitely an audience for this, and especially if you check out the Reddit AMA that I did regarding the book, but maybe don't check that out because there's a bunch of spoiler related questions in there, as you might expect. A lot of people who've read this really like it. In fact, Orion was one person who really liked it overall, liked it more than largely the rest of us did in the server. But I don't think that the audience for this book and my audience on this channel are necessarily one that's probably going to overlap overall. I don't not recommend the West Passage, but I don't necessarily recommend it for you either, because I think this is, if this is something that's going to click for you, it's really going to click for you. But for me, I don't think this fully worked out as a whole. So it's just one of those situations of like, make that decision on your own based on your own interests. If this seems like something that would click for you, absolutely check it out. I think it is worth giving a shot. And of course, you know, supporting a debut novel, supporting brand new authors and stuff like that is definitely a worthy goal as well. So if this is something you think you would like, I think it's worth giving a shot. But I also think that if you don't think it would necessarily work for you, I don't think the book is going to change your mind on that assumption, we will say. That's basically where I'm going to leave it, because that's largely how I feel on the West Passage. So even though I felt pretty mixed on it, however, I will also add that I am absolutely going to check out Jared's next book, whatever that one has. There's a ton of potential in this one that I do think he could expand on and improve upon for a second book somewhere. So I'm definitely inclined to check that out. I'm keen on checking out a second book when or if he decides to do something like that. But this one didn't fully come together. It had came pretty close in a lot of respects. I gave it 3 stars, and that's not necessarily a bad rating, but yeah, it didn't fully come together the way that I would have liked for it to. But that is the review. Either way, thank you for watching this video regardless. I appreciate it. I will see you guys next week, next Tuesday, for my final new McCarthy reading review, covering Blood Meridian, which is the last McCarthy book that I read for the first time. That is going to be a doozy of a review. We'll see how that one goes down. But thank you for watching this video regardless. Just like I said, I'll be back in the next video, and I hope to see you there.